attached armor plating, creating one of the first ironclad ships. The vessel was renamed the CSS Virginia. It was an enormous warship, 262 feet in length, with a beam of 51 feet, weighing 3,200 tons. It was protected by 4 inches of iron plating, and with a top speed of 8 knots, it took the Virginia half an hour to make a 180-degree turn.
And so the Virginia becomes kind of a hybrid ship. She's not a sailing vessel, but she's not going to be too far away from the technology that came before her, in that she was still going to have to fight broadside.
While the South was busy turning the Merrimack into the Virginia, the North found out about the top-secret project through spies. So the Union built its own secret weapon, the ironclad Monitor. John Ericsson, a Swedish designer, conceived and designed the novel steam-powered warship.
It was an incredibly brilliant design. It broke the bonds of the conventional ship design.
The Monitor was smaller than the Virginia, with a length of 173 feet, with a beam of 41 feet, weighing 987 tons. Its top speed was 8 knots. 8 inches of armor protected the innovative gun turret, which used 2 steam-powered engines to revolve 360 degrees.
In that it allowed a relatively small vessel with a relatively few number of guns, in this case 2. It could bring both guns to bear at the target at any angle to the vessel.
In the first confrontation between 2 ironclads, the Monitor met the Virginia at Hampton Roads Harbor, off the state of Virginia, in 1862. The Confederate vessel was already at battle, having crippled or sunk several Union wooden naval vessels, when the Monitor entered the scene.
When the Virginia encounters the Monitor, the Virginia seems to have the advantage. She has 10 guns to the Monitor's 2. However, the Monitor has something that no other ship in the world at that time had, a revolving gun turret.
The Monitor was hit 22 times, and the Virginia 20 by cannon fire during their 4-hour battle. However, neither vessel achieved a clear victory, since all the shells bounced off the armor. In the end, the battle was a draw, with each side believing it had won. The 2 ironclads never fought again. However, the real victory went to a future of iron and steel warships.
A new technology had overcome naval weapons, and thereafter woe befall any nation that continued to build wooden frigates, because the ironclads were now here.
Although never sunk in battle, the Monitor was lost during a storm on New Year's Eve in 1862. More than 100 years later, in 1973, the Monitor was discovered in 240 feet of water, 16 miles off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Through painstaking effort, parts of the vessel have been raised, including the famous revolving turret. The prized artifact was taken to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, where it rests today. It's housed in an enormous tank, containing a solution which will gradually remove the salt that has accumulated during almost a century and a half on the ocean floor. However, on this rare occasion, the Mariners Museum has agreed to empty the tank for modern marvels, so that we may take our cameras inside this revolutionary historic monument. The process takes hours, but eventually we set eyes on a true technological wonder. When the Monitor sank, it turned and rested on the bottom upside down. So to preserve its fragile state, the turret remains inverted in the tank.
Monitor's turret is a truly unique place. We are one of the few people to be inside of it since it sank in 1862. This is the device, if you would, that revolutionized naval warfare. During the course of the battle with the CSS Virginia, the Monitor's turret was hit many times by her artillery, including this potentially devastating hit, which distorted all 8 layers of the armor and did not break through. Here are the Monitor's 2 gun ports. These were the openings in the turret for the guns to fire out of. And when the guns weren't firing out of them, they became weak spots in the turret's armor. So to make up for that, they had these large port stoppers.
As each of the Monitor's cannons fired, it recoiled backwards and was loaded from the muzzle. This left an open port. To protect the crew from enemy fire, a 1,200-pound wrought iron block was moved into place by a system of pulleys. Each time a gun fired, the port stoppers swung into place to cover the open hole.
During the battle, there were 21 men inside here, plus the 2 guns. It was dark, it was smoky, it must have been hellishly loud. The enemy fire clanging off the outside of the turret. The guns themselves roaring and leaping. They were stretching the technology of the time to build this, and it proved to be quite successful. The modern warship was born in the turret of the USS Monitor in the year 1862.
Whether on sea or land, transportation of troops and supplies is a centerpiece to any military battle plan. Civil War commanders realized this all too well and depended on new technology that accelerated transport strategy beyond any previous wartime conventions. The USS Monitor was the first naval vessel to have a below-the-waterline flush toilet. Civil War tech will return on Modern Marvels. The modern military depends on a sophisticated transportation network to move troops and materiel to combat zones anywhere in the world. Civil War strategists made a monumental leap over their predecessors by employing a new mode of transportation: the Iron Horse.
The railroads were relatively new innovation in American transportation. And the military grabbed a hold of this technology to begin to utilize it both strategically and to move both people, goods, munitions, very much like the modern military today.
In 1860, a locomotive engine could travel at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. A horse and wagon fully loaded could at best do 12 to 15 miles per hour.
Those generals who kept railroads in mind generally succeeded. Any general who ignored a railroad would generally lose. In the autumn of 1863, an entire Union Corps, something like 20,000 plus men, were transported by train from Virginia to Tennessee. That would have been out of the question in earlier times.
The workhorse for the military on both sides was the American Type 440 engine. Its streamlined power design was reliable and durable. The fuel source was wood or coal burned in the engine's firebox. The heat changed the water in the boiler to steam, which was driven through pipes to the pistons. The pistons generating a back and forth motion were connected to the main rod. This rod was attached to the wheels, creating a rotation, propelling the engine.
And we'll look at the mechanics of running the locomotive, and the engineer, of course, had to be an expert at doing this because actually, with this boiler, he was sitting on a bomb. If he didn't control the water level of the boiler, he could have a boiler explosion.
The actual mechanics to operate the engine were quite simple. The fireman loaded the wood or coal in the firebox. This is the Johnson bar for forward or reverse. The engine speed was regulated by this throttle lever. pull back to accelerate or push forward to slow down. But the main focus for the engineer was the amount of water and steam regulated to the engine.
The water level in the boiler had to be maintained at the proper level. The engineer had 3 gauges to determine that level. He would always want the water to be above the first gauge, never to the 3rd gauge. But the important thing is, if the water is too low, this could cause a boiler explosion. If he opened this valve here and got steam out of it rather than water, he's in a lot of trouble.
In 1860, the North had about 21,000 miles of track, while the South had some 9,000 miles. However, without a system to manage all parts of the transportation network, nothing would go anywhere. In January 1862, the United States War Department created an agency called the U.S. Military Railroad. Since at the time, the military had no experience in modern transportation, the Union employed civilian experts. Herman Haupt, a civil engineer who had constructed private railroads, was drafted to make the trains run on time.
This is actually the first time in American history where the federal government took over and formed its own private corporation to run a transportation system. Herman Haupt actually did this by purchasing locomotives, funding them, and creating his own railroad inside the federal government.
His greatest achievement probably came in the Gettysburg campaign. He sent in crews, they built a new railroad. Herman Haupt was sending up about 1,500 tons of supplies per day to that army. Not only is that amazing, but the trains going back were not empty. He placed the wounded soldiers from Gettysburg on their trains, and some 15,000 of them were taken to military hospitals at railheads such as Baltimore and Washington. It was a truly incredible accomplishment. There are about 7,000 books on Gettysburg. Very few ever mention Herman Haupt's name. He should be one of the leading heroes of that campaign.
As the Civil War raged on and the North began moving into Southern territory, Union trains encountered a huge technological obstacle that literally stopped them dead in their tracks.
Railroad gauge in America is the distance between the 2 rails. In the North, standard gauge was, say, this wide. In the South, many of the railroads were like this wide, so the equipment couldn't fit on the tracks. It was that simple.
The Northern Railroad track width, or gauge, was 4 feet 8.5 inches wide, derived from the British who pioneered railroad technology. However, the South used a variety of gauge. There was no standardized width for the tracks.
Many of the armies literally had to pick up the tracks in the South and relay the track beds to standard gauge so that their locomotives could run on them. One of the great results of the American Civil War through the standardization of gauges North and South was the creation of a near national network of railroading for the first time in American history.
Once an army has been transported to the battlefield, communication and coordination are essential for every military operation. During the Civil War, orders sent by foot or horseback could take hours or days. A breakthrough technology gave commanders the unprecedented ability to communicate messages in mere seconds. The American railroad track width of 4 feet 8.5 inches derives from the distance between the wheels on a Roman chariot. During the 1800s, the British used this standard for their railroad tracks, and America followed suit. Civil War tech will return on Modern Marvels. In Iraq, today's military relies on an enormous telecommunication network to keep command and control in